It's a good thing your house is so big, Mom. Matthew said those words so casually that for a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. He stood in the middle of my living room with his hands in his pockets, smiling like a man announcing wonderful news instead of a hostile takeover. Behind him were Jessica's parents, Robert and Susan, carrying large suitcases. Sarah stood near the doorway with her 2 children, already looking around the house as if she were choosing rooms. And the second floor will be perfect for Jessica's parents, Matthew continued. Sarah and the kids can use the guest room downstairs. We'll all help around the house, so it'll actually be easier for you. Easier for me. I stared at him in silence. The house around us suddenly felt unfamiliar, invaded before anyone had even unpacked a single suitcase. Jessica avoided looking directly at me. Susan stood there with her lips pursed in smug satisfaction while Robert crossed his arms like a man waiting for paperwork to be finalized. Sarah looked nervous but not nervous enough to leave. And my son looked completely comfortable. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the audacity, not the disrespect. The comfort. The certainty that I would surrender because I was his mother. Because people like Matthew always mistake love for weakness. The silence stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Matthew finally laughed awkwardly. Mom? Say something. I tightened my grip on the coffee mug in my hand. At 68 years old, after decades of marriage, widowhood, work, sacrifice, and loneliness, I had learned something important about people. The most dangerous betrayals never arrive screaming. They arrive smiling. And standing there in my living room, looking at the son I had raised with everything I had, I realized something cold and terrible. Matthew no longer saw me as a person. He saw me as a resource, a house, a bank account, a safety net, an obligation. Not a mother. Not anymore. But to understand how we reached that moment, you need to understand what happened long before the suitcases arrived at my door. Because this story didn't begin with an invasion. It began with a small theft. A theft that shattered everything I believed about my son. My name is Eleanor Vance. I worked 42 years as a county clerk. 42 years. While other people chased excitement, I chased stability. I balanced budgets. I saved receipts. I packed lunches instead of eating out. I learned how to stretch every dollar because life teaches women of my generation one brutal lesson early. No one is coming to save you. My husband Harold understood that too. He was a quiet man. Honest. Dependable. The kind of man who fixed broken shelves before you noticed they were loose. The kind who kissed my forehead every morning before work even after 30 years of marriage. We built this house together brick by brick, payment by payment. Not literally, of course. But emotionally, absolutely. Every room carried years of sacrifice inside it. The kitchen where we counted pennies after Matthew needed braces. The living room where Harold slept in his recliner after double shifts. The garden we planted together after finally paying off the mortgage. Nothing about this house came easily. That's why losing Harold almost destroyed me. Cancer took him slowly, cruelly. By the end, he looked smaller somehow, like the illness had eaten not just his body but pieces of his spirit too. And after he died, everyone expected me to collapse. But I didn't. I adapted. I learned how to exist in silence. At first the silence terrified me. Then eventually, I fell in love with it. I built routines. Morning coffee on the patio. Gardening. Books before bed. Walks in the afternoon. Phone calls with Victoria, my best friend for over 20 years. It was peaceful. Lonely sometimes, yes. But peaceful. And peace becomes precious when you've suffered enough chaos. Matthew began visiting more often after Harold died. First I appreciated it. He'd bring groceries sometimes. Fix little things around the house. Sit with me during dinner. Jessica came too, always polite, always smiling. She helped with dishes, complimented my cooking, called me Eleanor instead of Mom, which bothered me slightly, but not enough to matter. Back then I believed their visits came from love. I understand now they came from opportunity. The transition happened slowly, so slowly I barely noticed. Matthew began spending weekdays at the house because it was closer to work. Then he started using Harold's old office upstairs. Then Jessica started leaving things behind. Sweaters, shoes, toiletries, little territorial markers disguised as accidents. I ignored the discomfort because mothers are trained to ignore discomfort. We tell ourselves we're overreacting. We tell ourselves family matters more than boundaries. We tell ourselves sacrifice is love. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was trusting Matthew with my banking information. I only did it after Harold died. Just in case of emergencies, he'd said. And because he was my son, I believed him. The first unauthorized transfer happened in November. $3,000. I discovered it while reviewing my monthly statements at the kitchen table. First I assumed fraud. I called the bank immediately. But when the representative explained the transfer had been made using my personal login credentials from inside my own home, something inside me went cold. Not scared. Cold. 'Cause deep down, I already knew. Matthew arrived that evening around 6. Jessica was with him carrying takeout containers and smiling like everything was normal. I asked her politely to give us a moment alone. The second she disappeared upstairs, I placed the bank statement on the table. What is this? Matthew glanced at it once and froze. That told me everything. His shoulders dropped instantly. Mom! No. Don't start with excuses. Did you take $3,000 from my account? Silence. Then finally, I was going to pay you back. Not denial. Not apology. Just justification. I remember staring at him across that kitchen table wondering where exactly I had lost my son, because the man sitting in front of me looked nothing like the boy I raised. You stole from me. I borrowed it. You accessed my private account without permission. I needed help. You needed permission. His jaw tightened. Mom, I had a legal issue. If I didn't pay immediately, my wages could have been garnished. And that gave you the right to steal from me? We're family. There it was. The sentence that would repeat itself for the next year like a curse. We're family. As if family erased morality. As if blood canceled accountability. As if motherhood meant permanent surrender. I looked at him carefully. You planned this. No. You knew my passwords. You waited until I wasn't home. You transferred the money quietly and hoped I wouldn't notice. His silence confirmed it. That hurt more than the money. Because theft committed impulsively is one thing. Theft committed calmly is something else entirely. I want every cent returned by the end of the month. Mom! Every cent. Jessica came downstairs at exactly the wrong moment. Her eyes darted between us nervously. What's going on? Your husband stole from me. Matthew stood abruptly. I said I was paying it back. When? Soon. Soon. A useless word people use when they have no intention of doing anything. That night after they left, I sat alone in the dark living room thinking about the expression on Matthew's face. Not guilt. Not shame. Annoyance. As if I had inconvenienced him by objecting. That realization settled inside me like poison. Because once someone stops feeling guilty for hurting you, they become capable of much worse. And I was right. 2 weeks passed. No repayment. No apology. Nothing. Matthew still visited occasionally pretending everything was normal. Jessica still made tea in my kitchen. They laughed at television shows. Talked about work. Avoided the subject completely. Finally one afternoon I confronted him again. When are you returning my money? He sighed dramatically. "Mom, things are tight right now." "Tight enough to steal?" Jessica immediately jumped in. "Eleanor, we're trying." "No," I interrupted. "He's trying to avoid consequences." Matthew's expression hardened. "You're acting like I robbed a stranger." "You robbed your mother." "That's dramatic." "No. Dramatic would be me calling the police." That finally got his attention. Jessica sat upright immediately. "Police?" "Yes. Because what he did was illegal." Matthew laughed nervously. "You wouldn't actually do that." "Wouldn't I?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Good. I wanted him uncertain. I wanted him uncomfortable. I wanted him to understand that motherhood was not immunity. But instead of learning humility, Matthew learned resentment. And resentment is dangerous in entitled people. Because entitled people don't reflect. They retaliate. A week later he called me late at night. His tone was softer than usual. Almost vulnerable. "Mom, Jessica's parents are in trouble." There it was again. Another request hidden behind emotional manipulation. Apparently Susan and Robert had lost money in a failed investment and were facing eviction. And naturally, Matthew believed that problem belonged to me. "They need $2,000. "No." He paused. "You didn't even think about it." "I did. The answer is still no." "Mom, they're family." "No. They're your wife's parents. You have the money." That sentence told me everything. Not "can you help?" Not "would you consider it?" Just, "you have the money." As if possession alone created obligation. When I refused again, his voice turned cold instantly. "I didn't realize you'd become this selfish." Selfish. Interesting word. Women are called selfish the moment they stop sacrificing themselves. Men call boundaries cruelty when those boundaries inconvenience them. I hung up shaking with anger. 2 days later another unauthorized transfer appeared in my account. $2,000. This time I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I felt something worse. Acceptance. Because I finally understood the truth. Matthew believed my money belonged to him. Not metaphorically. Literally. When I called him, he barely even sounded ashamed. "Robert and Susan were desperate. So you stole from me again." "I helped family." "You robbed your mother." "You're exaggerating." "No, Matthew. You are minimizing." Then came the sentence I will never forget. "You live alone in a giant house with money sitting untouched while people suffer." I remember gripping the phone so tightly my fingers hurt, because suddenly everything became horrifyingly clear. He resented my stability. He resented my independence. He resented the fact that I had something he wanted but couldn't control. And from that resentment came justification. If I had more than he did, then taking from me became morally acceptable in his mind. That was the moment something fundamental broke between us. Not trust. That had already died. Something deeper. Respect. And once respect dies, love becomes dangerous. Because love without respect invites destruction. I should have cut ties then. I know that now. But mothers don't abandon hope easily. Even when hope is poisoning them. Especially then. So when Matthew later invited me to Susan's birthday dinner insisting it would help bring the family together, I ignored my instincts and agreed. That decision would humiliate me in ways I still struggle to describe. And it would finally force me to see my son exactly as he was. Not who I wanted him to be. Not who I remembered. Who he truly was. I should have said no to the birthday dinner. Even now, looking back on everything that happened afterward, I can clearly see the moment where instinct tried to save me. It happened when Matthew smiled after I agreed to go. Not a relieved smile. Not a grateful one. A victorious smile. At the time I ignored it. Because mothers spend years convincing themselves not to notice dangerous things about their children. We soften red flags into misunderstandings. We turn manipulation into stress. We call disrespect immaturity. And we do it because accepting the truth feels unbearable. Saturday arrived gray and humid. Matthew picked me up around 4 in the afternoon. Jessica sat in the passenger seat wearing a cream-colored dress and pearl earrings, looking polished in a way that made me suddenly aware of how simple my own clothes were. No one spoke much during the drive. The silence inside the car felt rehearsed, like two people hiding a secret. Susan and Robert lived in an aging apartment building on the opposite side of town. The elevator groaned so loudly on the way up that I wondered if it might collapse between floors. The hallway smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and old carpet cleaner. When the apartment door opened, music and laughter spilled into the corridor. Susan greeted me dramatically. "Eleanor." Finally. She wrapped her arms around me before I could react. The perfume she wore was overpowering, sweet enough to make my stomach turn. "You look wonderful," she lied. Behind her, Robert raised a beer bottle toward me from the living room. Come in, come in. Family's all here." Family. Again that word. Always that word. Inside, the apartment was crowded with relatives, neighbors, and people I had never seen before. Everyone seemed loud, comfortable, connected. I immediately felt like an outsider. Introductions blurred together. Cousins, friends, aunts. People smiled politely at me, but there was curiosity underneath it. The kind of curiosity people have when they've already heard stories about you before you arrive. I noticed how Matthew stayed close to Robert most of the evening, laughing harder than necessary, agreeing with everything he said, trying desperately to belong. That's the tragedy of weak men. They will betray anyone for approval, even their own mothers. For the first hour, everything remained civil. I sat quietly near the window sipping soda while conversations flowed around me. Jessica moved constantly between the kitchen and living room, playing the role of attentive daughter. Susan soaked in attention like sunlight. Robert grew louder with every drink. I watched, listened, waited, and somewhere deep inside me, unease slowly expanded. Then came the toast. Robert stood heavily from his chair, glass raised high. Everybody quiet down. Conversations stopped. Laughter faded. Susan smiled proudly beside him. "I want to make a toast to my beautiful wife," Robert announced. 65 years old and still smarter than everyone else in this room. People laughed. Susan touched his arm theatrically. Robert continued. "And I also want to toast to family. Real family. The kind that steps up when things get hard." His eyes shifted toward Matthew. Matthew smiled nervously. My stomach tightened immediately. "Because let me tell you something," Robert said louder, swaying slightly. "Hard times show you who really cares about people." A few guests nodded. I saw Jessica stiffen near the kitchen doorway. "And some people," Robert continued slowly, "have plenty but still refuse to help anybody." The room grew quieter. I felt eyes beginning to turn toward me. Robert smiled. Not kindly, predatorily. "You know the type," he continued. "People sitting alone in giant houses with money stacked away while everybody else struggles." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted him. Matthew stared down into his drink, and suddenly I understood. This wasn't random drunkenness. This was intentional. I had been invited there to be publicly shamed. "You got people with empty rooms," Robert said, voice growing sharper. "Empty lives and full bank accounts acting like generosity will kill them." Someone coughed awkwardly. Susan avoided looking directly at me now, because unlike Robert, she still possessed enough shame to recognize cruelty while participating in it. Robert lifted his glass higher. "Good thing my son-in-law's got a bigger heart than certain other people." A few uncomfortable chuckles floated around the room. Matthew said nothing. Not one word. That silence hurt more than Robert's insults ever could, because strangers owe you nothing. But your child owes you humanity. I sat completely motionless. My humiliation burned so hot it felt physical. But I refused to give them what they wanted. No tears. No yelling. No dramatic exit. People like Robert feed on emotional reactions. I would not feed him. So instead I simply looked at Matthew. And in that moment something inside me quietly died. Not love. Mothers don't stop loving so easily. But hope? Yes. Hope died there. Because any son capable of watching his mother be humiliated publicly without defending her is capable of almost anything. The drive home was suffocating. Jessica stared out the passenger window the entire time. Matthew gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. No one spoke. Streetlights flashed across the windshield in long silent intervals. I sat in the back seat feeling strangely calm. Not because I wasn't hurt, because I finally understood. Sometimes clarity arrives through humiliation. You stop negotiating with reality. You stop making excuses. You stop lying to yourself. When we finally reached my house, Matthew stopped at the curb without turning off the engine. He still wouldn't look at me. I opened the door slowly. Then before stepping out, I said quietly, "The next time someone humiliates me while you stand there silently will be the last time you ever see me." That finally made him look at me. For one brief moment, guilt flashed across his face. Real guilt. But it vanished almost immediately. "Mom, I don't want explanations." I shut the door, walked into my house, locked it behind me, and cried harder than I had cried since Harold died. Because betrayal from strangers wounds pride. Betrayal from your child wounds identity. For days afterward I moved through life like a ghost. I watered my plants, made coffee, answered Victoria's phone calls. But internally something had shifted. I no longer trusted my own judgment. How had I raised someone capable of this? What had I missed? Had the signs always been there? Or had Matthew slowly transformed into this version of himself over time? Those questions haunted me. And then Sarah arrived. Sunday morning. 9:30. Doorbell ringing repeatedly. When I opened the door, there she stood holding a small suitcase and smiling nervously. "Hi, Eleanor." Immediately my instincts sharpened. Sarah rarely visited. In fact, she barely contacted me except during holidays. Seeing her standing there with luggage felt calculated. "I was passing through town," she explained quickly. "Thought maybe I could stay a few nights with you." "Passing through? With a suitcase? Interesting. Where exactly are you passing through to?" "Oh, just nearby." Lies always sound vague. I folded my arms. "Did Matthew send you?" Her hesitation answered before her mouth did. "No." "Yes, he did." Sarah sighed dramatically. "Okay, fine. He mentioned maybe you were lonely lately." Lonely. Another weaponized word. People always assume older women fear loneliness more than disrespect. They're wrong. "I'm not having guests." Her expression changed immediately. "Seriously?" "Yes." "Eleanor, it's only for a few days." "No. You live alone in this huge house. And we're family." There it was again. The sacred excuse for entitlement. I stared at her calmly. This house is not a public shelter for relatives who only remember me when they need something. Her face hardened. "Matthew was right about you." "What did he say?" "That ever since Uncle Harold died, you've become cold and selfish." I almost laughed. Interesting how selfishness always means refusing to surrender resources. When directed at women. "I think you should leave now." "You know what? Fine. Stay here alone with your money." She dragged her suitcase down the walkway furiously. I closed the door and leaned against it afterward, exhausted. because every interaction with them followed the same pattern: request, pressure, guilt, insult, punishment. Emotionally manipulative people all use identical strategies, and they become furious when boundaries interrupt those strategies. That afternoon, Victoria came over. The second she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. What happened now? I told her everything. The dinner, Robert's speech, Matthew's silence, Sarah showing up with luggage. Victoria listened quietly while stirring sugar into her coffee. Then finally she said something that changed me. "Eleanor, they're testing you." "What?" "They're testing your boundaries to see how much they can take." I frowned. "You think this is deliberate?" "I know it is." Victoria leaned forward. "Listen carefully. Your son has learned something dangerous. He's learned that if he pressures you emotionally long enough, eventually you'll give in to avoid conflict." I stared down into my coffee. As she was right. Every compromise I had ever made with Matthew came from exhaustion, not agreement. "They escalate because escalation works," Victoria continued. "And people like that never stop voluntarily. The only thing that stops them is consequences." Consequences. That word stayed in my head long after she left, because until then I had still approached everything emotionally. Like a mother. Like someone trying to save a relationship. But what if the relationship was already gone? What if all that remained was manipulation disguised as family obligation? 3 days later I received my answer. I was reading in the garden when I heard voices outside the gate. Several voices. I looked up and felt immediate dread. Matthew stood outside holding luggage. Behind him were Susan and Robert carrying bags. Jessica walked beside them. All four looked entirely too comfortable. Matthew unlocked the gate using his copy of my key. My pulse spiked instantly. They walked into my garden like people arriving at a vacation rental. Not guests. Occupants. "What is this?" I demanded. Matthew smiled nervously. "Mom, relax. There's been an issue with Susan and Robert's apartment." "A water leak," Susan added dramatically. "We just need somewhere temporary," Matthew said. "A few days at most." "You did not ask me." "We knew you'd say no." That sentence stunned me. Not because it was cruel. Because of how casually he admitted it. "So you decided my answer didn't matter?" "Mom, come on. You have space." I looked at the luggage. The amount of it. Too much for a few days. Robert dropped a heavy suitcase onto my patio. "We won't be any trouble." I turned slowly toward Matthew. "Did you seriously bring people to live in my house without permission?" "They're family." "No. They are your wife's family. They're still connected to you." "No. They are connected to you." Susan stepped forward, smiling tightly. "Eleanor, surely you understand helping people in need." The audacity nearly impressed me. These were the same people who mocked me publicly weeks earlier. Now they expected housing. I suddenly understood something terrifying. None of them believed they had done anything wrong. Not one of them. Because entitlement rewrites reality. In their minds, my refusal to surrender my home made me the villain. Not their invasion. Not their disrespect. My resistance. I looked directly at Matthew. "Give me your key." "Mom." "Now." Something in my voice finally pierced through his confidence. Slowly, reluctantly, he removed the keychain from his pocket. I held out my hand. He dropped it there without meeting my eyes. "Now leave." Robert scoffed loudly. "This is unbelievable." "No," I replied calmly. "What's unbelievable is arriving at someone's home with luggage before receiving permission. We're family." Susan snapped. "And family should understand the meaning of boundaries." Matthew rubbed his face in frustration. "You're overreacting." "No. I'm finally reacting appropriately." That shut him up. Because deep down he knew I was right. People only call boundaries overreactions when those boundaries inconvenience them. Finally, Jessica spoke quietly. Maybe we should go. Robert looked furious. Susan looked insulted. Matthew looked trapped. Good. Let him feel trapped. I had spent an entire year trapped emotionally by his manipulation. They gathered their luggage slowly. Nobody apologized. Not really. People like that rarely apologize sincerely because sincere apologies require accountability. And accountability threatens entitlement. When they finally left, silence returned to my garden. Beautiful silence. I locked the gate immediately afterward. Then I walked through my house checking every room like someone reclaiming stolen territory. And for the first time in months, I felt safe. But safety has a strange way of exposing grief. Because once the chaos faded, reality remained. My son had become someone I barely recognized. And worse, I was beginning to understand that he might never change. Not really. Not deeply. Not permanently. That realization shattered me more quietly than any argument ever had. After I threw them out of my house, something strange happened. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully. No anxiety twisting in my chest. No replaying arguments in my head. No guilt gnawing at me in the dark. Just silence. Clean, uninterrupted silence. I woke the next morning before sunrise and stood barefoot in my kitchen making coffee while soft light spilled across the counters. Everything felt still. Safe. Mine. And I realized something almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Peace feels unfamiliar when you've spent too long surviving emotional chaos. That frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Because it forced me to confront a painful truth. I had become accustomed to dysfunction, accustomed to tension, accustomed to constantly managing Matthew's moods, needs, excuses, and crises. Without even realizing it, my entire emotional life had started revolving around preventing conflict with my own son. That's what manipulative people do. They slowly turn themselves into the center of your nervous system, even when they're absent. Especially when they're absent. For several weeks, Matthew disappeared completely. No calls. No texts. No surprise visits. Nothing. At first I kept expecting him to show up. Every time a car slowed outside my house, my stomach tightened. Every time the phone rang unexpectedly, I braced myself. But the calls never came. And gradually, something inside me began healing. I returned to old routines I had abandoned. I joined a yoga class at the community center. Started attending a local book club again. Spent afternoons gardening without constantly checking my phone. Victoria noticed the difference immediately. "You look lighter," she said one afternoon over tea. "I feel lighter." That's what happens when someone stops draining your life force. I laughed quietly. But she wasn't wrong. I began noticing small things again. The smell of jasmine after rain. The comfort of reading by an open window. The pleasure of cooking meals only I liked. 4 years motherhood had consumed my identity so completely that I forgot I existed outside of being needed. Now suddenly, no one needed me. And instead of destroying me, it set me free. Still, freedom comes with grief. Because every peaceful moment carried an uncomfortable shadow beneath it. Matthew, my son, no matter how much he hurt me, part of my heart still searched for him automatically. That's the tragedy of motherhood. Love remains long after trust dies. One afternoon in July, nearly 2 months after the confrontation in my garden, my phone rang. "Matthew." I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Hello." His voice sounded different immediately. Tired. Frayed. "Mom, I need to talk to you." I leaned back slowly in my chair. "What happened?" "It's Robert." Of course it was. Everything always led back to another emergency. Another crisis. Another reason I was expected to sacrifice myself. He needs heart surgery. Silence settled between us. He could die without it. There it was. The emotional burden placed carefully at my feet. A test. Would I rescue them again? Would guilt overpower boundaries? The insurance won't cover everything, Matthew continued carefully. We still need $8,000. $8,000. Not asked timidly. Not even requested respectfully. Presented almost like an invoice. I closed my eyes briefly. Matthew. Mom, please. This is life or death. What happened to the money Jessica sold her car for? It covered part of the hospital bills. And your savings? Gone. And loans. We already tried. Meaning, you're the last option. Not the first. Never the first. Just the emergency reserve they expected to access whenever life became difficult. I spoke slowly. I'm sorry Robert is sick. But I am not giving you $8,000. Silence. Then, why? The disbelief in his voice almost amazed me. Not sadness. Not disappointment. Disbelief. Because entitled people genuinely cannot comprehend rejection. Because I no longer trust you. This isn't for me. No. It's for the people who humiliated me publicly, while you stood there silently. He apologized. No, he didn't. He was drunk. Drunk words reveal sober thoughts. Matthew exhaled sharply. So you'd really let someone die over pride? That sentence changed something inside me forever. Because suddenly I understood the game completely. No matter what boundaries I set, no matter how justified my reasons, manipulative people would always redefine self-protection as cruelty. Always. If I surrendered everything, good mother. If I protected myself, monster. There was no winning. Only surrender or resistance. And I was finally too exhausted to surrender anymore. My money is for my future now, I said quietly. For my security. My health. My old age. You have enough. That's not your decision to make. His breathing grew heavier. You know what Jessica said? He snapped suddenly. She said maybe my mother stopped loving me years ago and I was too blind to see it. Pain flickered through me instantly. Not because it was true. Because Matthew wanted it to hurt. People reveal themselves most clearly during desperation. And in that moment my son chose emotional violence. I love you very much, I said softly. But love does not mean unlimited access to me. You sound like a therapist. You sound like someone who has never respected boundaries. Then came the tears. Real tears this time. I heard him crying quietly on the other end of the line. And for one terrible moment, I almost broke. Because mothers are biologically engineered to respond to their children's pain. Even grown children. Especially grown children. I nearly offered money. Nearly apologized. Nearly surrendered everything again. But then another memory surfaced. Robert humiliating me publicly. Matthew saying nothing. And just like that, the weakness passed. I'm sorry, Matthew. My answer is still no. I hung up. Then immediately blocked Jessica's number after the flood of messages began. Please reconsider. Dad could die. You're all we have. How can you live with yourself? Then came Susan's messages. Cruel ones. Vicious ones. She called me greedy. Heartless. A miserable old woman. She said someday I'd be sick and abandoned too. And no one would help me because I deserved loneliness. I blocked her too. Then I sat alone in my kitchen trembling. Not from guilt. From adrenaline. Because standing up to manipulative people feels terrifying when you've spent years conditioned to appease them. Victoria came over that evening carrying wine and cheese. The second she walked in, she hugged me. You did the right thing. How do you know? Because you finally chose yourself. I cried then. Not dramatic sobbing. Just quiet, exhausted tears. I feel horrible, I admitted. A man is sick. Yes, Victoria said gently. And that's tragic. But you are not responsible for saving every person connected to your son. I keep wondering if I'm becoming cold. No, Eleanor. You're becoming unavailable for exploitation. There's a difference. That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Unavailable for exploitation. Not cruel. Not selfish. Unavailable. 3 weeks passed after that phone call. No messages. No updates. Nothing. I didn't know whether Robert survived surgery. Part of me wanted to know. Another part didn't. Then one Saturday morning while watering roses in the garden, I saw Matthew's car pull into the driveway. Alone. No Jessica. No Susan. No Robert. Just him. He looked terrible. Thin. Exhausted. Older somehow. I opened the gate but didn't invite him inside. We stood facing each other awkwardly. How's Robert? He survived. Unexpected relief moved through me immediately. Not because I cared deeply about Robert himself. Because now his death would never become another weapon held over my head. Matthew shoved his hands into his pockets. We got the money eventually. How? Jessica sold her car. Susan pawned jewelry. I took out loans. Good, I thought instinctively. Not cruelly. Realistically. Adults solving their own problems. That's how life works. Then Matthew looked at me differently. Almost carefully. I came here to tell you something. I waited. You were right. I blinked. What? You were right about me. The words sounded painful coming out of him. I used you. I manipulated you. I kept thinking if I pressured you enough, eventually you'd give in. I remained silent. Because apologies without accountability are meaningless. But accountability without excuses? That was new. I knew what I was doing, he admitted quietly. Even when I stole the money. Even when I lied. I always knew. That hurt more than denial would have. Because I walked into my house with strangers in suitcases. Life had finally touched him. Consequences had finally touched him. But consequences don't automatically create wisdom. Sometimes they just create self-pity. What do you want me to say, Matthew? I don't know. His voice cracked slightly. Maybe that you still love me. Pain tightened in my chest immediately. Because despite everything, I did. I will always love you, I said quietly. He looked relieved for half a second. Then I continued. But love without respect destroys people. And I won't destroy myself anymore trying to prove my love to you. The relief vanished from his face. Now only sadness remained. Real sadness. Not manipulative sadness. Human sadness. For the first time in over a year, I almost recognized my son again. Almost. He nodded once. Then turned and walked slowly back toward his car. I watched him leave feeling something unexpected. Not triumph. Not revenge. Grief. Because sometimes healing requires accepting that relationships cannot return to what they once were. And that acceptance hurts no matter how necessary it is. The following months were peaceful again. Peaceful enough that I started believing maybe the worst was over. That was my mistake. Manipulative cycles rarely end cleanly. They pause, then restart wearing different clothes. 3 months later, Matthew returned again. This time with Sarah beside him. She looked nervous, almost ashamed. We sat awkwardly in the living room while sunlight stretched across the carpet. Matthew cleared his throat. Mom, we came to apologize. I stayed silent. We treated you terribly, Sarah added quickly. Especially me. Matthew nodded. I know apologies don't fix things. But I want to try rebuilding trust. Interesting choice of words. Not forgiveness. Trust. Specific. Concrete. What exactly are you proposing? Matthew inhaled deeply. I want to pay you back. That surprised me enough to show on my face. All of it. He continued quickly. I can't do it immediately, but I can start making monthly payments. How much? $200 a month. Not impressive. But still. It was the first concrete responsibility he had voluntarily accepted. And what do you expect in return? Nothing. Lie. Everyone expects something. Eventually. But this time I decided to listen anyway. I just want a chance to prove I can change. Sarah spoke quietly. And I'd like a relationship with you too, Eleanor. A real one. I studied them both carefully. People can fake tears, fake remorse, fake vulnerability. But consistency is harder to fake. I'll accept the payments, I said finally. But understand something clearly. This does not erase what happened. Matthew nodded immediately. I know. No surprise visits. No asking for money. No manipulation disguised as emergencies. If you want trust rebuilt, you earn it slowly. I understand. And for a while, he actually seemed to. Every month he arrived exactly on time with an envelope containing $200. No drama. No emotional speeches. No requests. Just quiet consistency. For the first time in years, I allowed myself a dangerous thought. Maybe people really could change. Maybe pain had humbled him. Maybe consequences had finally taught him what boundaries meant. I should have known better. Because manipulative people often behave correctly right until the moment they want something again. 6 months passed after the day I threw everyone out of my house. 6 months of silence so complete that it almost felt unreal. No surprise phone calls. No guilt-filled messages. No knocks at the door demanding more from me than I had left to give. At first, I kept waiting for the next disaster. Every time a car slowed near my gate, my stomach tightened. Every time the phone rang late at night, I braced myself for another crisis, another manipulation disguised as family obligation. But eventually something strange happened. The fear faded. Life settled into a rhythm that was entirely mine. I woke up early every morning and watered my roses while the neighborhood was still quiet. I started painting again. Something I had abandoned decades earlier when motherhood and marriage consumed every spare moment of my life. My living room slowly filled with unfinished canvases and the scent of acrylic paint. Victoria joked that I was becoming an artist in my retirement. Maybe she was right. For the first time in years, I no longer felt like I was surviving. I was simply living. And then one rainy Thursday afternoon, the past returned again. Not with shouting. Not with demands. With a letter. I found it tucked carefully into my mailbox. Handwritten in messy familiar script. Matthew. I stared at the envelope for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. Part of me wanted to throw it directly into the trash unopened. Another part, the softer part one could never completely kill, needed to know what he had to say. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Mom, I know you probably don't want to hear from me. Maybe I don't deserve for you to read this. But I need to say these things anyway. I've spent months angry at you because it was easier than admitting the truth about myself. The truth is that you were right. About everything. I kept blaming everyone else for the consequences of my choices because accepting responsibility terrified me. I blamed Jessica. I blamed her parents. I blamed money problems. I even blamed you. But deep down, I knew the common denominator in every disaster was me. After the divorce and bankruptcy, I had nobody left to blame anymore. No safety net. No excuses. Just myself. I've started therapy. Real therapy this time, not the fake attempts I used to make whenever I wanted sympathy. My therapist asked me something during our second session that destroyed me. She asked, "When was the last time you treated Your mother like a human being instead of a resource. I couldn't answer, because I honestly couldn't remember. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect reconciliation. I don't even expect a response. I just wanted you to know that for the first time in my life, I finally see the damage I caused. And I'm sorry. Not because my life fell apart. Not because I need help. Not because I'm lonely. But because you deserved better from your son, Matthew. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and placed it on the kitchen table. Victoria arrived an hour later for our usual Thursday coffee, and she immediately noticed my expression. What happened? I handed her the letter silently. She read it slowly, then looked up at me carefully. What do you think? I don't know, I admitted honestly. Part of me believes him, and part of me thinks he's simply gotten better at sounding sincere. Both things can be true, she replied gently. People can change while still carrying the habits of who they used to be. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Matthew alone in some small apartment, finally forced to confront himself without anyone left to hide behind. And despite everything, despite the lies and betrayal and manipulation, the image still hurt. Because no matter how much damage existed between us, he was still my child. The next morning, I did something I never thought I would do again. I called him. He answered on the second ring, and the silence on the other end told me he was shocked. Mom, I got your letter. Another silence. I wasn't sure you'd read it. I almost didn't. I understand. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. I'm not calling to say everything is forgiven, Matthew. I know. And I am not ready to pretend the past didn't happen. You shouldn't. His voice sounded different somehow. Quieter. Less defensive. Less entitled. Frightened me more than the shouting ever had. I just wanted to ask you one thing, I said carefully. Why now? Why finally take responsibility after all this time? Matthew exhaled shakily. Because losing everything forced me to realize something horrible. What? I became the kind of man who only loved people when they were useful to me. The honesty of it hit me harder than any apology could have. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, "Therapy made me understand something else too." What? You spent years trying to save me from consequences because you loved me. And I spent years punishing you for it. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Not because everything was fixed. Nothing was fixed. But because for the first time in years, I felt like I was speaking to someone who finally saw me clearly. Not as an obstacle. Not as a bank account. Not as an enemy. As his mother. I don't know what happens now, I admitted. You don't have to decide now, he said quickly. I'm not asking for anything from you anymore. And somehow that was the first thing that made me believe he might truly be changing. We spoke for only 10 more minutes before ending the call awkwardly, like strangers learning a new language together. Afterward, I sat alone on my patio watching the rain fall over the garden. The pain was still there. The memories were still there. The scars would probably always remain. But for the first time there was something else too. Possibility. Not certainty. Not trust. Not reconciliation. Just possibility. And sometimes after enough heartbreak, that is more than enough to begin again. The months after that phone call unfolded slowly, cautiously, like two people trying to cross a frozen lake without knowing which step might crack the ice beneath them. Matthew kept his word. He did not ask me for money. He did not pressure me for forgiveness. He did not suddenly pretend we were a happy family again. Instead, every few weeks he would send a simple message. Hope your roses are blooming well this spring. Or, I passed by that bakery you used to love and thought of you. Small things. Careful things. First, I barely responded. A short thank you. A polite acknowledgement. Nothing more. I still did not trust him. And trust, once shattered enough times, does not grow back quickly. It grows quietly underground, invisible for a long time before anything appears on the surface. One afternoon in early September, Matthew asked if he could meet me for coffee. Not at my house. Not anywhere private. A small cafe downtown. I stared at the message for nearly an hour before answering. 1 coffee. 1 hour. His response came almost immediately. That's fair. The day of the meeting, I nearly canceled 3 different times. Victoria thought I should go. Not for him, she clarified while stirring sugar into her tea. For you. So you'll know whether peace is truly possible or not. So I went. When I walked into the cafe, I barely recognized him at first. Matthew looked older. Not physically older exactly, but worn in a way I had never seen before. The arrogance that used to dominate every room he entered had disappeared. He stood when he saw me approach, nervous like a teenager on a first date. Hi, Mom. Hello, Matthew. We sat across from each other awkwardly. For several minutes, conversation stayed shallow. Weather, work, traffic. The safe topics strangers use when they are afraid of saying the wrong thing. Then finally, Matthew looked down at his coffee cup and said quietly, I sold the watch Dad gave me. The statement caught me off guard. Why? To pay off part of my debt. I stayed silent. I almost didn't do it, he admitted. That watch was the last expensive thing I owned. And for a while, I kept telling myself I deserved to keep at least one thing. He looked up at me carefully. Then I realized that's how I used to think about everything. That my wants always mattered more than my responsibilities. I noticed then how thin he looked. How tired. Not dramatic tiredness. Not self-pity. Real exhaustion. The bankruptcy was bad? I asked quietly. Matthew laughed softly without humor. You know what's terrifying? Losing everything isn't actually the worst part. What is? Realizing how many relationships you destroyed before you lost it. He rubbed his hands together nervously. Jessica won't speak to me anymore. Sarah keeps her distance. Most of my friends disappeared once I stopped being useful or fun. His expression hardened slightly. And honestly, I earned that. For the first time in years, I saw something in my son I had not seen since he was very young. Humility. Not performative guilt. Not manipulation. Humility. I spent so many years believing everyone else was responsible for my unhappiness. He continued. Therapy forced me to confront something ugly. What? I became emotionally lazy. Instead of building my own stability, I kept trying to borrow yours. The sentence settled heavily between us. Because it was true. Painfully true. The waitress brought fresh coffee, interrupting the silence for a moment. Matthew waited until she walked away before speaking again. I don't expect us to magically become close again, he said carefully. I know I destroyed too much for that. I appreciated that he said it plainly instead of hiding behind emotional speeches. But I would like the chance to slowly earn a place in your life again. Even if it's small. I looked out the cafe window. Outside, people hurried down the sidewalk carrying shopping bags and umbrellas, completely unaware that my entire emotional world seemed balanced on this tiny conversation. I don't know if I can ever trust you fully again, I admitted. You shouldn't yet. And some things you said to me. My throat tightened slightly. About your father. About me being controlling. Matthew closed his eyes briefly. I know. Those things stayed with me. They should, he whispered. Because they were cruel. I studied him carefully. You really mean that now? Yes. What changed? Matthew took a long breath before answering. I stopped confusing accountability with rejection. I frowned slightly. He continued carefully. Every time you confronted me about my behavior, I interpreted it as abandonment. Like if I wasn't perfect, I was unlovable. So instead of taking responsibility, I attacked you first. The words hit painfully close to the truth. Where do you think that came from? I asked softly. Matthew hesitated. I think Dad avoided conflicts so much that I never learned how to face consequences in a healthy way. And when he died, his voice weakened slightly. You became the only authority figure left in my life. So every disagreement felt enormous. I sat very still. For years, I had viewed our relationship only through the lens of betrayal. But now, for the first time, I could also see the brokenness underneath it. Not an excuse. Never an excuse. But an explanation. And sometimes explanations matter. I made mistakes too, I admitted quietly. Matthew looked genuinely startled. I wasn't always emotionally available after your father died. I became hard in ways I probably didn't notice. Mom! No, let me finish. I held up a hand gently. That still does not justify what you did. But I also know grief changed both of us. Tears filled Matthew's eyes instantly. It shocked me how quickly they appeared, like he had been holding them back for years. I missed you, he said finally, his voice breaking. Even when I was angry at you, I missed you. Something inside my chest cracked open then. Not fully, not completely, but enough. I reached across the table slowly, and after a brief hesitation, I placed my hand over his. Matthew looked down at our hands like he could hardly believe it was happening. This doesn't erase the past, I said firmly. I know. And rebuilding trust will take years, not months. I know. And if you ever manipulate me again, even once, this relationship ends permanently. He nodded immediately. Understood. For the first time in a very long while, I believed he truly understood the weight of those words. When we left the cafe an hour later, Matthew hugged me carefully, uncertainly. Like someone approaching something fragile, he was terrified of breaking again. And as I stood there in the cool autumn air watching my son walk away, I realized something unexpected. Forgiveness was not a single moment. It was a process. Messy, slow, painful. But perhaps healing worked the same way. Not all at once. Just one honest step at a time.